flame has lit up the world from within. All things, individually and collectively, are interpenetrated and flooded by it. You who mould the manifold so as to breathe your life into it, I pray to you. The first verse of the universe pours forth like a sea of mystery. Out of the void, unmanifest silence. Space-time comes into existence, unseen, shaping, swirling, unfurling. Hydrogen, helium, divine is revealed within galactic whirlpools. As energy flows in, a star collapses, supernova explosion, a cloud of cosmic debris, drawn together by gravity, by the mystery of attraction, primordial bonding, universe action, stardust swirling, swarming gases, organizing and forming masses. See, the sun is the one that spun the 9 others. Give birth to Mother Earth and her sisters and brothers, Mercury, Venus, Mars and Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto. Every one is the sun. The sun is the one. Everyone. Everybody better wake up. And the earth gave birth to continents and oceans, shaping and shaking in waves of emotion, crashes of lightning, bombarding and striking, exposing the globe as it glows like a strobe, and setting the stage for the first cell of life. So simple, so basic, so primal that I place it at the top of the chain from which all life sprang. More forms adorn the earth as they bring diversity, dispersing the song of creation. Ring in the dawn, sing along in celebration. I just want to celebrate life. I just want to celebrate Earth. I just want to celebrate the cosmos. I just want to celebrate. The sea comes alive, starts to thrive with new life forms. Storm swept the planet, plants crept on granite enchanted by the sun's solar power. The earth gave birth to green leaves and flowers. Lava flows, mountains rose, tropical islands, forests and meadows. Fed by the freshwater streams, the veins, heavenly rains drain back to the sea. The fish are set free as they swim onto sand. Fins turn to limbs and they limp onto land. Amphibians, reptiles, new styles of creature, seeing through new being the range of her features. The earth, your mother, gave birth to eyesight. Looking within as she spins in the sunlight, on to the dawn, to the day of the dinosaur. Pterodactyl soars, Tyrannosaurus rex, towering, devouring. So who's up next? Mammals and primates, all life interrelated, divinely created. So don't you think it's time we celebrated? I just want to celebrate life. I just want to celebrate Earth. I just want to celebrate the cosmos. I just want to celebrate. So when Father Thomas Berry was talking about the importance of telling the story of the universe, he said that we can't leave it to the scientists to tell the story because they just... so he called for the poets and the musicians and the artists to help in telling the story correctly. And one of the poets that responded to this was Drew Dellinger, a rapper from Prescott, Arizona, and that was his version of the universe story. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I guess I'll start in 1973, which I was reminded of because I met Vi, we were living together, Vi and her family and my family were living at High Street in Nimbin in 1973, and I haven't hardly seen her since. And anyway, so in 1973 I arrived back in Australia after 5 years living in London. My wife then and I travelled back overland through India and ended up in Nimbin. While in India, I ran into Buddhist meditation and became very attracted to that way. And so when I got back to Australia, Greta and I wanted to start a meditation centre and a meditation community. And in 1975, we helped build a Buddhist meditation centre in the forest, a couple of valleys east of Nimbin at the Channon. And in 1976, we bought some land nearby, which we call Bodhi Farm, and we were going to become caretakers of that meditation centre, organise meditation retreats. And I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life doing that and growing organic veggies and delivering babies and so on. And so it was with quite a shock in 1979, in August of 1979, that I found myself sort of sucked into what years later we realised was the first direct action in defence of rainforests, not only in Australia but anywhere in the world. And I was just there by accident, really. I'd gone to the Channon Market one Sunday and was listening to the band, and in between sets, one of my neighbours got up on the stage and said that the Forestry Commission, as they were then known, were coming in the next day to log the rainforest at the end of Terania Creek Road. And even though that was like 6 or 7 k's from where I'd been living for some years, I'd never visited the end of Terania Creek Road. I didn't know there was a rainforest there. I didn't know what a rainforest was. I didn't know that there were rainforests in Australia. In fact, hardly anybody knew that. They weren't even called rainforests then. Around Lismore, they were just known as the bastard scrub. And there was nothing too attractive about them. They were kind of damp and dismal and full of leeches and thorns and things. And so when the blockade started the next day at Terania Creek, around Lismore, all the people were just whispering to each other, "The hippies have gone nuts." You know, they just couldn't believe that we had chosen this particular forest to defend. And it was really in the course of that campaign that the passion that we felt and the enthusiasm that we felt was able to communicate itself. I mean, obviously, the times were ripe for what was happening, but in any case, from this kind of starting from a place of complete ignorance, within 2 years, an opinion poll found that more than 70% of the people of New South Wales wanted an end to rainforest logging, and Neville Wran's government legislated with the historic decision that protected a whole string of national parks from the Border Ranges down to Barrington Tops, including the Nightcap National Park, where we'd been, doing our little theatre and getting arrested and so on. So that was, as you can imagine, a very empowering start to life as a rainforest activist. By this time, I'd sort of left Bodhi Farm, and my whole life had been consumed by this new passion, this new interest. And I'd begun the Rainforest Information Centre because it became clear that this was happening all over the world, and that at that time there weren't any organisations anywhere with the rainforests on their agenda. So we started the Rainforest Information Centre to sound the alarm and to try and wake people up. So in the process of Terania Creek, we had couldn't help but get a bit of an education about rainforests and about ecology. And so I guess it was no surprise in 1982 when we got a message from a group then known as the Tasmanian Wilderness Society, run by a dole-bludger called Bob Brown, asking whether we would come down and help set up a blockade down in Tasmania, where the temperate rainforests were threatened by a dam that was being built on the Franklin River. So a couple of combi loads from Nimbin Way headed down that way, and we helped set up the base camp at Strawn, and that was, many of you are old enough to remember that. Thank you. That was the largest such action in Australian history. More than 3,000 people came from all over the country for that, to this remote wilderness, and more than 1,500 people were arrested in the process. And that blockade had been timed to coincide with the federal elections of 1982. And 10 days before the elections, the leader of the opposition, Bob Hawke, seeing the writing on the wall that people were more interested in the Franklin River than they were in any of the other arguments going on about the elections, announced that if elected, the ALP would stop the dam. And at that point, I think it was 1,100 people left Tasmania and fanned out to more than a dozen marginal electorates around the country where less than 2 percentage points separated the government from the opposition in the opinion polls. And we went from door to door. I remember I was up in Brisbane, so I went from door to door in those electorates asking people to vote for the ALP to stop the dam. And each of those electorates swung to the Labor Party, and Bob Hawke's first words when he was elected were, "The dam will not be built." And indeed it was not. So it's hard to even imagine today that such a thing is possible, that thousands of people rallying for an environmental cause in this country. But that's how I remember it. I'm sure that that's what happened. And from there, in 1985 and 1986, we went up to the Daintree, Cape Tribulation for the tropical rainforests, and once again, national parks and eventual World Heritage listing rewarded our efforts. And so this was all very exciting, but at the same time, it was becoming clear, first of all, the importance of the rainforests, that what had just been an entirely emotional response for me from being in the majesty and the grandeur and what I felt was the intelligence of those forests, it turned out that they're the very womb of life. They're home to more than half the species of plants and animals in the world, and the satellite photographs were showing them disappearing worldwide at a rate that less than a single human lifetime remained before they'd be utterly annihilated. And so while we were having some success in Australia in saving a little pocket here and there, worldwide, for every forest that was being saved in the first half of the 80s, 1,000 forests were disappearing, and clearly there was no way to save the planet one forest at a time. That unless we could address the underlying psychological or spiritual disease that allows modern humans to imagine that we can somehow profit from the destruction of our own life support systems, clearly these actions would be merely symbolic, of no particular significance to the future of the world. And so it was in that context that I began to try and understand more about how is it that humans behave in such a foolish and self-defeating manner, and how is it that supposedly intelligent sapiens could behave in such a way. There were various clues. Paul Ehrlich, who was the professor of ecology at the University of California, said what we're doing to the forests, he said, we are sawing off the branch that we're sitting on. So that was a great metaphor, I thought, clearly a stupid thing to do regardless of how much the timber in that branch might have been worth. And likewise, James Lovelock, who proposed the Gaia theory, the idea that the earth itself is alive, not just an inert rock with life blooming mysteriously on the surface. He said that what we're doing to the forests is as if the brain were to decide it's the most important organ in the body and started mining the liver. So, we see this very intelligent brain able to consider this complicated operation, but clearly deluded, not understanding that it's part of the same body and that it can't profit by this mining operation. So it was with a considerable feeling of relief that I happened upon a philosophy of nature called deep ecology in about 1986 or 1987, where for the first time I felt like a coherent explanation of this psychological dimension. The term deep ecology was coined by the professor of philosophy from Oslo University, the late Arne Næss. According to Næss, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis we find the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world. The illusion of separation. So this might sound kind of a bit, I don't know, airy-fairy, but it's just talking about something very simple. To understand what he was talking about, all that you have to do is hold your breath for 5 minutes while you think about it. That we are inextricably embedded in the nature of the world. The nature out there and the nature in here are one and the same, are continuous. Any attempt to pull ourselves outside that is bound to fail. And but according to Ness, we're not. He said that this illusion of separation grew out of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the centre of everything. So we are the crown of creation. We are the measure of all being. There's this incredible arrogance with the way that human beings view themselves and our role, our position in the universe. And Ness said that this anthropocentrism ran so deeply in the culture, had been part of our culture, different cultures, for so long that we weren't going to be able to think our way out of the mess that had been created. Famously, he said that ecological ideas aren't going to be enough to save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But what he was talking about was that the anthropocentrism goes back at least as far as the Old Testament, and the idea that only man was created in God's image, only human beings have a soul, other creatures don't have a soul, the earth itself has no soul, rivers clearly have no soul, and that nature is to be in fear and trembling of us, and we are to subdue and dominate it. So this may be a mistranslation of the Old Testament, but it's the kind of popular understanding, and it's the understanding that has led to this anthropocentric fallacy corrupting every institution of our society and indeed the very language that we speak. Even to speak of the environment makes it sound as if it's over there somewhere and conceals from us the reality that the environment out there and myself are one and the same, that there is no out there where we can dump our garbage. It's all in here. It's all like this huge being that's cycling material and endlessly, and so that intellectually that's probably not much of a stretch these days. That 30 years ago, when we first started talking about this, people might argue, but nowadays everybody kind of agrees with this position, more or less. But the trouble is, as Arnie Ness pointed out, merely understanding this, merely holding this as an intellectual belief doesn't change anything. That to give you another example of the way that language is influenced, I found out about a little town in Texas called Earth. And Earth, Texas, with a population of less than 1,000 people, if you look it up, you'll see that it gets an uppercase E, as every place created by human beings has an uppercase E. But if you give Earth, solar system, an uppercase E, Google spell check will correct you, because not having been created by human beings, the Earth doesn't deserve an uppercase. So once you start recognising this anthropocentrism, you see its impacts everywhere. And one of the places where it reigns supreme is in economics, which I would propose is not a science at all, but is a religious belief system based upon various premises that are completely fanciful, like infinite growth is possible on a finite planet and various things, and also based upon the premise that value is created by human beings, that the earth itself has no value according to if you look at the philosophy of classical economics, the earth has no value until we humans add our labour and intelligence to it. So the earth is just dirt until we turn it into, plastic or metal or something else. And that means that, as an environmentalist, I would often find myself campaigning for a place where inevitably there would be a cost-benefit analysis of protecting the place versus exploiting it. And the cost-benefit analysis invariably found that it was more important to exploit it than to preserve it, and that's because it had no value. The trees have no value until you cut them down and turn them into wood chips or something else, and the fact that the leaves produce oxygen, that the roots hold the soil in place, that they are the home for the myriad creatures is politely called an externality in economic speak. It's not included in the equation. There is no value there. So the dice are loaded. It's impossible within the current systems, within the current institutions. And so Arnie Ness said that in order to find a way through this, we need to nourish this ecological identity, which has become kind of eclipsed by our social identity. That we all know what our name, rank and serial number is, we know our religion, we know our nationality and so on, but we don't really experience ourselves as the biological creatures that have been evolving here for 4.5 billion years. That's not part of our identity. That's something that we read about in a textbook, but we don't experience ourselves in that way. And so Arnie Ness said that he felt that what was necessary were community therapies to heal this illusion of separation and to allow us to experience ourselves as being part of the earth and the earth as being part of us. So in 1988, hugely inspired by his work, I and an American Buddhist philosopher, Joanna Macy, started working on developing these community therapies. And the first of those we called the Council of All Beings. And I'm offering a workshop here this weekend, and so now, 30 years later, the Council of All Beings is still part of that. All of the other things happening this weekend are things that have been developed in the meantime, but the Council of All Beings remains something that I find hugely useful in this process of moving from ecological ideas to ecological identity. As Sally said, the book that we wrote, Thinking Like a Mountain Towards the Council of All Beings, which was we wrote with Arnie Ness and Pat Fleming and published in 1988, has been translated into 12 languages, and last year was translated into Mandarin, which I find very hopeful. And it's you can get it secondhand on Amazon. It's out of print in English at the moment, but the Rainforest Information Centre website has the text, and so it's freely available for anyone who's interested. So a couple of years after writing the Council of All Beings, I had the good fortune to be a witness to a ceremony that was being conducted in the southwest of the United States on a mesa in the desert by a group of Hopi indigenous people. And the whole village took part, the children, everybody, the old people, and there was just a handful of us outsiders who were just sort of, in a corner watching. And to my shock, I discovered that they were performing the Council of All Beings, which I thought that Joanna and I had invented a couple of years before, but which these people informed me that they had been doing without stop for 12,000 years. So as I studied that, I discovered that I couldn't find an example anywhere of an indigenous society that had maintained its ceremonial and ritual life that didn't have ceremonies that allowed the human community to regularly meet, the entire community to get together and to celebrate our relationship with the rest of the natural world, to celebrate all our relations, to honour nature, and to allow ourselves to become a little humbled by remembering the tiny part that we play in the entire ecology. And so when I realised that, I started to think that maybe Arnie Ness's idea of a community therapy was not the best metaphor, because a therapy is something that's supposed to have a start and an end. You know, there's something wrong with me, I find a therapist, and if the therapy works, then it ends and I'm healed, and end of story. Whereas these people have been performing this ceremony for 12,000 years and it never ends, and it seems to me that that's because there must be this propensity in human beings. It's not just modern humans that have this problem, but there must be this tendency in human beings to separate away into merely social ideas of who we are. And Indigenous people have all had the wisdom to construct these ceremonies in order to counteract that tendency. I can't see any other reason why it would be necessary to remember these things on a regular basis. And so now I think of the workshops that I offer not so much as therapies, but as a kind of social, cultural reclamation project, because all of us, our ancestors were pagans once upon a time and worshipped the seasons of the year and the plants and the animals and the stars and those things. And so the workshops are a kind of series of experiential processes that we used to include ceremonies that we borrowed from other cultures, but discovered that many cultures didn't take kindly to that at all, that having had everything else stolen by us modern people, stealing their rituals was the last straw. And so since then we've sort of we only use processes that we've created ourselves rather than ones that we've borrowed from other people. Anyway, there's a few of us here, and a few other people who aren't here are going to be spending the next 2 days finding out more about this. And if any of you are free for the next couple of days and feel like joining us, you'll be most welcome. So the title of this talk is Deep Ecology and the Conservation of Nature. And so I finished with the deep ecology for the moment, and but we'll be happy to answer questions later on or stay on for a discussion afterwards. The conservation of nature is kind of where I came into this with the rainforests and have continued. So at the moment, today, I've been working on protecting a biological reserve in Ecuador called the Los Cedros, which we helped to create in 1988, the same year that Thinking Like a Mountain was published. There's a kind of interesting story that goes with this. In 1986, we started the first internet service provider in Australia outside a university and or the government. It was called Pegasus Networks. And as a result, we were using email before anybody knew what it was. And as a result of that, we got an invitation from a group of lawyers in Washington, D.C. called the Environmental Defence Fund to become part of an international campaign that they were trying to start to reform the lending policies of the World Bank. That the environmental impacts of the World Bank's projects were horrendous, and as we read their material, we agreed to be part of that. But in the process of becoming part of this international campaign, we discovered that the Australian Government Aid Agency, which was where our tax money would go to them and from them to the World Bank, that for every dollar that they sent to the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, $7 was spent on bilateral aid straight from Australia to PNG and the Solomon Islands and so on. And we had exactly the same policies as the World Bank did, because there was a revolving door between ADAB, as it was then called, it's now AusAid. There was a revolving door, and 1 minute someone would have a job with ADAB, and the next minute they'd be working for the World Bank, and it was just this kind of club, and they had the same principles and the same philosophy. And so we started a campaign to reform the environmental policies of the Australian Government Development Assistance Bureau, and in the process of that, we're able to gather a coalition of all of the environment groups and also the aid groups, Community Aid Abroad, Australian Council of Churches, Freedom from Hunger Campaign, and so on. So we had this huge letterhead with everybody's letterhead on it, taking up half the page, and we're able, through that, to get a Senate inquiry into the environmental effects of the Australian aid program. And then slowly that inquiry came to its conclusion in 1988. They had this severe criticisms of ADAB. All of our criticisms became the Senate's criticisms, and as a result, these reforms were initiated where, for the first time, ADAB had to obey Australian environmental laws, even if they were working in a country that didn't have environmental laws of its own. They had to do environmental impact studies for the first time on their projects and so on. But to rub salt in the wound, I suppose, the Senate mysteriously decreed that ADAB would have to start a new funding window where $1 million a year would be available to Australian NGOs to create new standards of environmental excellence in the delivery of Australian aid. So that was a surprise to everyone, and we thought that, as having been the main thorn in their side, we would never see any of that money. But on the contrary, every proposal that we put to them over the next 3 or 4 years, while that before John Howard got in and closed that funding window, every proposal was funded. And we came to the conclusion that because they wanted us to be so busy writing proposals and reports that we wouldn't have time to harass them anymore, and also we'd have a conflict of interest. So we started a new organisation called AidWatch. Carol Sherman from our group and Lee Rhiannon, who's now a Green senator, started AidWatch so that the kind of oversight of ADAB could continue while we could do our projects. And one of those projects was we got a grant to start the Los Cedros Biological Reserve in Ecuador in 1988. A long introduction. Anyway, so since 1988, we've had to save Los Cedros on at least 6 occasions. If it's not illegal logging, it's poaching, and if it's not poaching, it's land developers. It's one thing after another, but we've always sort of had the tenacity to show up, and as a result of that, Los Cedros, according to the Professor of Ecology at the University of Oregon, one of the researchers who uses that place, it's now the best forested watershed in Western Ecuador. So it was just, it was just, everything was like that 30 years ago, but now nothing else has had the kind of, tenacious defence that Los Cedros has had. But now it's facing its biggest challenge because it's protected as a, I can't speak Spanish, but it's spelt Bosques Protectores, protected forest. That's the bureaucratic designation, and that designation has just been dissolved by the current government, and they have handed out mining leases on more than 1 million hectares of protected forests, which are no longer protected, including Los Cedros. And so that's kind of, oops, here we go again, and that's what I'm working on at the moment. Joanna Macy, before we met and started working on deep ecology, she was doing workshops called Despair and Empowerment, using the honouring our pain for the world and recognising that pain for the world correctly handled is an incredibly empowering tool for actually making change. And so the workshops that I facilitate, I may be the facilitator, but I'm also a participant. So one of the things that we'll be doing tomorrow morning is an exercise I learned from Joanna Macy about honouring our pain for the world, and that's where I get my own, it's like environmentalists are notoriously subject to burnout. That because we're looking at the bad news when everybody else is turning to the sports page or something like that, you know, many environmentalists suffer psychologically as a result. And but what I found is that by participating in these workshops as well as facilitating them, I'm immune to that burnout. That I can, no matter how bad the news is, I can remain focused on solutions and things like that. And so I'm really looking forward to this workshop because it's been a couple of months since my last one, and Los Cedros is weighing heavily on my mind, and I could use the empowerment. And looking forward to next week with a new burst of energy for the things that we're doing. So one of the things that Los Cedros needs is signatures on a petition. The mining company that's been given the right to mine there, it's not till next April. The legislation doesn't cycle doesn't allow the mining to begin till next April, and so in the meantime we're trying to get pressure on the company in Canada to see if we can do something over there. And if you go to rainforestinformationcentre.org, right on that welcome page, you'll see the petition, and I'd really appreciate anyone giving us a hand, both signing the petition yourself and passing it on to other people. I once was blind, but now I see. I understand that the planet is the source of me, literally. Just like a mum gives birth to a babe, Mother Earth's given birth to everything that's been made. Word to the mother, source of every other thing, every being in the ring of creation. And every individual is a manifestation of the grace innate in this place, space, and time, expressing the blessing, caressing my mind. Holy osmosis, that's what the cosmos is. Boom, universe, earth, human. From the beginning, the spinning universe possessed a spiritual interior inside the manifest. Blessed with a blast from the past, free at last as the Big Bang rang, sprang, sang from the start through the void, like a joy from the heart of the dark. And the light's the birthright of us all. You and I are all the fireball. A higher call inspires all with a sense of place. Let us find the divine mind behind every face. I've just begun to recognize the whole soul force. Word to the mother, word to the source. We've got to get back to the mother. We've got to get back to the earth. We've got to get back to the mother. We've got to get back to the earth. Word to the mother. So how dare we have the nerve to disturb the planetary source, the very force that brought us alive? If she ain't in effect, there ain't no way to survive. How can we see no wisdom from the ecosystem? This industrialized phase, crazed to pave highways, yikes, 50,000 toxic sites, nuclear power plants constructed with haste, without any clue what to do with the waste. Radiation seeping deep in the nation, losing patience with corporations and abusers, grinning like they're winning when we'll all be the losers. They ignore natural forces, deplete our resources, no remorse, we're off course, hold your horses. Mother, may I try to say why? My society lost sight of the whole as we try and we try till we die to control the earth dream that can never be tamed and that can never be named. What's a shame and is lame is that we thought it was clever to dam every river ever. Never, never land is at hand until we see and rediscover. There ain't no other. It's absurd to have to say it, but word to the mother. We've got to get back to the mother. We've got to get back to the earth. We've got to get back to the mother. We've got to get back to the earth. The story of the mother, as I reminisce, was enough to make this brother eco-feminist. How can we limit the limitless exponential growth potential? Economy is secondary, Earth's essential. The mother exists in every wave on the sea, in every bird in the sky, in every leaf on a tree. Community, unity, you and me family, all of us children born of 4 billion years of the blood, sweat and tears of the earth. We need to let her be. Let her go. Set her free, let her fly, let her flow, let her grow and unfold the way the mother intended. Activities that damage the earth must be suspended. Listen, because we're missing what the mother's advice is. She'll help us deal with ecological crisis. She's mightier than Aphrodite or Isis, and twice as creative, illustrative of the point. When the earth gives birth to the now. Still, we try to milk every sacred cow. We need to chill until we see that no creature is my enemy. They're all kin to me. Earth is the remedy for the malady. She's the truth at the root of reality. The elements of my bones are left over from the swirling stardust of a supernova. Made by the earth and the breath of the one, reigns in the veins, in the flames of the suns. In the heart, each part contains the sum of the whole. Earth body, earth spirit, universe, soul. Word to the mother. You gotta love her. We've gotta get back to the mother. We've gotta get back to the earth. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer questions, but happier still if you care to make any statement, you know.
To me, deep ecology implies a sense that all of us here in this room, I'm sure, walking in here tonight, we might have seen the half moon in the sky, we smell the leaves, we smell the grass, and we all enjoy that, and we even wonder at it. But it seems to me deep ecology is another step. Have you any hints that you could give to us of how we make that extra step of bringing that in to some sort of wholeness within ourselves?
Well, I mean, one hint is the kind of experiential processes that the workshops offer and that Indigenous people practice, and another is just spending time in wild nature and going for walks in the bush, and especially one of the programs that I participate in up on the north coast mainly is called Yatra, and Yatra is walking through the bush in silence with a group of people. So we might spend a week walking through nature, and we'll sit around the fire and talk together in the evenings and so on, but while we're walking we're in silence, and it's amazing the difference when you're not conversing, you know, just to making your way through a wild place that way. So they're two things that work for me. But within every spiritual tradition, there are the growing shoots of a kind of ecological awakening. And, you know, I mean, Thomas Berry, you know, you go back through Teilhard de Chardin and, you know, just go back through thousands of years of people that influenced that. And in the same way, within Buddhism, there's a new kind of a shoot called engaged Buddhism that was started by a Vietnamese monk called Thich Nhat Hanh, and which has become quite influential. And one of the places where that's really blossomed, it was that in Thailand, a group of because the Buddha himself lived his whole life in the forest. He was born under a tree, lived his life in the forest, did all his teaching in the forest, and he died under a tree, and was enlightened under a tree as well. And so these forest monks began ordaining trees, the old growth trees that were being threatened in Thailand. They would tie a robe around the tree, an orange cloth, and you know, do the incantation that turned this tree into a monk, and the woodcutters wouldn't touch those trees. And somehow the king of Thailand heard about this, and on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of his coronation, he was crowned as a boy, and on the 60th anniversary he decreed that he wanted every community to encourage their monks to do the same thing, and the plaques claim that 50 million trees were ordained as a result of that, you know, so that this small band of monks had this incredible influence over the whole country. And then 20 years later, just 2 or 3 years ago, some monks in Cambodia found out about it, and they stopped a dam from being built by ordaining the trees in the path of the dam, so that if the dam had been built, it would have flooded these monk trees. And so the spirit, you know, bringing together the power of spirituality and ecology seems to offer a tremendous promise.